Hello everyone, my name is Garry Wills. I want in this video to present a playthrough of a war game of one of the scenarios in my new book, Wellington at Bay, which tells of the Battle of Villamuriel on 20th of October 1812 during the retreat from Burgos. This is the campaign map, and the army of Portugal was advancing down the road from Burgos through Torquemada to Margos, and the British and their allies, the Portuguese and the Spanish, occupied the line of the Carrion on the left. On the morning of the 25th, Macoun and Gautier were the advance guard, and while Gautier went to Tariego to cross the river there, Macoun diverted to Calabazanos, having learned that the village of Villamuriel de Corato and its important crossing over the river Carrion was held by the Anglo-Portuguese. This is the battlefield that we'll be seeing in 15mm scale in a few moments, and there are several points of interest. The village itself features a quite substantial church, but other than that at the time had only about 100 houses. It was on the main carriage road from Palencia to Duenas, and the other main habitation was the monastery at Calabazanos. In terms of crossing the river, that was only possible at the two fords marked here and the bridge. The weather had been quite bad in the preceding week with a lot of rain, so the river was running fast and deep. The other big feature of the battlefield, second only to the river, is the dry Canal de Castilla, which was under construction when the war broke out, and so consequently was unfinished and was empty. It's a significant feature such that men standing in the bottom of the canal can't see out, so it's quite an obstacle. Another feature of the battlefield were these wine vaults or bodegas, which created some rough ground on the western side of the canal. These vaults were quite extensive excavations. Some are reported to have had 100 steps underground, and basically they provided rough ground for skirmishers to defend. And the other feature of significance on the battlefield was the high ground. It rose from about 715 meters by the river up to 800 meters. Orders of battle for the day. The Allied force constituted the 5th Anglo-Portuguese Division, and they were under some new commanders. So Major General John Oswald arrived that morning to take command. Edward Barnes wasn't officially in command of the brigade for another 2 days, but had arrived just in time to take part in the battle. The division was supported by a brigade of the Galician Army of Spain, the 6th Army. So all told, they had 5,500 men with 6 guns. The French were comprised of the 5th Division of the Army of Portugal, led by General Division Macoun. This was the division beaten by the 5th Anglo-Portuguese Division at Salamanca just a few months earlier. The division comprised 2 brigades, each of 2 regiments, each of 2 battalions, and they also had 5 foot guns in support. Also supporting the division were the Light Cavalry Brigade of Defos, which comprised 6 squadrons of light cavalry plus a small detachment of a further regiment. This brigade was actually Curto's brigade, who was currently away commanding the division. The whole force was supported by Suham's 1st Reserve Horse Artillery Company, and with 5 guns. So in total, the French had just under 6,000 men and 10 guns. So when we look at the deployment of those troops on the map, the significant feature is that earlier in the day, Macoun had sent Darnald's brigade across the river. They'd managed to make a partial repair of the bridge, which had been destroyed by Wellington's engineers, and he'd deployed the 15th line extensively in skirmish order, and they'd got across the canal and were threatening the British position and the Spanish position, specifically on the Anglo-Allied left. Montfort's brigade, as you'll see, hardly takes any part in the battle at all. In terms of the game, I'm using Black Powder 2nd edition with my own tweaks. I use 15mm figures and therefore the centimetre scale. So every measurement in the rulebook is measured in centimetres rather than inches. I also use a special rule from Last Arguments of Kings supplement, where no firing is allowed if the unit has moved more than once that turn. In terms of the general, I'm not a big fan of re-rolls in the command system for Black Powder. If you insist on having re-rolls, you might as well increase the staff rating by 1, because that's pretty much the effect. But if it may be important for you for a club night game, for instance, when you only got 1 shot at it, instead I use the original rule for generals, where the division commander in this case is a commander-in-chief and can give orders to other units that haven't yet got orders. Staff ratings I've used to try and force historical behaviours on the generals. So, for instance, Spry never moved off the hill, so he has a very low staff rating of 6. Similarly, Montfort hardly moved. He also has a low staff rating. And the final point is skirmishers. I do skirmishers slightly differently. This shows how I represent skirmishers. I use these 6cm movement trays, which show the correct frontage and depth for a deployed skirmish company. So a French company of 4 figures or 130 men in this would have 2 of these bases. And I also give skirmishers light cover if they've moved less than 6 centimetres to represent the effect of the greater dispersion than is allowed for in the rules. The game itself lasts 8 game turns or 2 hours from 4 p.m. in the evening. The sun will have set by the end of turn 6, and the 8th turn ends in complete darkness after civil twilight. The Allied army moves first. So in terms of victory conditions, the Allies, specifically John Oswald, was told by Wellington to drive the enemy from the right bank of the river. So consequently, his victory condition is to advance the banks of the Carrion without the division being broken, in Black Powder terms, and the fate of Lignan's rather fragile brigade does not count towards the army morale of the Allies. On the other hand, the French have a simple task, which is to repulse the Allied attack, breaking both the British brigades while remaining on the right bank of the Carrion. In reality, the French were quickly forced back onto the other bank of the Carrion. So it's actually quite difficult to judge how much of a fight they were prepared to put up. But for the sake of the game, I've set this as the victory condition. This is a view of the battlefield as I've recreated it in 15mm scale. I've used a large amount of the Callistra Hexon terrain, and the Canal de Castilla, which I referred to earlier on, carves across the middle of the battlefield using the Callistra World War I trench system, which works quite well for this because it doesn't have a lot of trenchy detail moulded on the inside of the ditch. And I've used a lot of liching just to blend it into the terrain and give it a bit more height so that it replicates the not being able to see out of the canal feature. The roads and river sections are all from Timecast, and the buildings are a mixture of JR from Manchester Militant and hovels. On the left you can see a photograph of a view from the high ground, and this looks across towards the bridge. It gives you some view of the height that is a bit lost in these wargames representations. The ground rises up probably 8 or 9 hexon heights, but it's still more compatible with 2mm scale figures than 15. This shows the French left, which is made in 3 parts. On the left you can see Montfort's brigade standing waiting. He's actually himself across the river with some skirmishers. One of his brigades, one of his battalions rather, is deployed as a light infantry mixed battalion, as in Clash of Eagles. Next to them on this side of the river is the light cavalry brigade waiting patiently, and to the right obviously the artillery, which combines his Macoun's own foot artillery with the horse artillery from the reserve. On the other side of the canal, on the left of this photograph, is Spry's brigade with the broken 8th Castores behind them. To their right, to the right of them rather, is Barnes's brigade deployed in column as instructed by Wellington for their assault. Then come the light infantry battalions of Barnes's brigade and Pringle's brigade with the 2 companies of the Brunswick Earls light infantry. Then on the hill is Lawson's artillery brigade, and to their right, to the right of them rather, is Pringle's brigade of 3 battalions. The 2nd, 4th foot right at the back on the top of the hill, with the 1st, 4th and the 2nd, 30th and the 2nd, 44th in front of them, and they're facing off against the 2nd, 15th Ligne from the French infantry, who have their skirmishers deployed amongst the bodegas using the light infantry mixed formation from Clash of Eagles. The end of turn 1, we can see here that the Lignan's men failed their command test, so stay stationary, although their skirmishers were able to get disorder. They're facing French skirmishers. In the centre, Pringle's brigade moved slowly forward. Move distance on this steep hill I've reduced to 8 centimetres as a normal move. And meanwhile, Barnes has moved down to the canal and has received some fire from the skirmishers, which has disordered one of the units. There's been an early setback for the British, though. The Barnes's light light infantry battalion charged across the canal at the waiting French skirmishers and lost the melee and were broken in the break test. Spry looks on and does nothing. End of turn 2. We're still in a situation where the Union's Spanish are sitting there watching what's going on. So the French have started to send their skirmishers across the canal with a view to outflanking the British line. Meanwhile, the brigade in the centre, Pringle's brigade, starts a steady series of very bad command rolls. Given they're reliable infantry with a staff rating of 8, so a 9, they managed not to move for a while. So I think through 2 10s in a row for them. Similarly, Barnes failed his command rating, so ended up missing out on the opportunity to get across the river. Turn 3, we can see here the Union is again watching what's going on, and the French are continuing to close on the Spanish skirmishers. And the skirmishers are able to fire, but have done no injury to the Spanish at this time. In the centre, Pringle manages to get forward with one of his, 2 of his 3 battalions. The third was disordered and unable to advance, despite being an elite 4+. And yet another battalion, the 1st 9th there, has been disordered by the French skirmish fire. On the right flank, however, Barnes has got at least 2 of his battalions forward. The 1st 38th on the right, and their junior 2nd battalion on the left. But they're facing a significant amount of skirmish fire from the retiring French. As you can see, Spry's actually moved forward to the edge of the canal in this turn. In turn 4, the Spanish regiment, the Volunteers de la Corona, were able to charge the French skirmishers who evaded back across the canal. Meanwhile, Pringle stayed static as his brigade was frozen by a poor command roll. And there was another disaster in the for the British in turn 4. The 1st 38th happily charged the French skirmishers in front of them and dispersed them. They failed their break test. But in the French turn, the French artillery were able to put enough casualties on the battalion that it was forced to take a break test and broke. Also in the end of turn 4, you can see the French retiring slowly in front of Pringle's brigade, and they've moved back to Lawson's Mound in the centre. On turn 5, again not much happening with the Union's brigade, so their command rolls have not been terribly successful. He has a command factor of 7, so should have had better success than he did. Meanwhile, Pringle has got across the the canal, and one of his battalions, the 1st 4th, is closing in on the French skirmishers, while the dual battalion of the 2nd Battalion 30th and 2nd Battalion 44th Foot are acting together as a single battalion this day, actually in the canal in support. Meanwhile, Barnes's brigade has actually been broken by the artillery casualties on the 2nd 38th, and so that's forced the whole brigade to retire. However, the skirmishers for Pringle's brigade have managed to get through the village and start to place the French reserves under skirmish fire. Meanwhile, on the left turn at the end of turn 6, de Montfort's brought his battalion back across the ford, as happened in reality, although they're under no real pressure to do so now. Barnes has withdrawn and is continuing to withdraw back up onto the hill. On the other hand, Spry's brigade remains on the lip of the canal. So, also at the end of turn 6, there's been a combat between the 1st 4th Foot and the 2nd Battalion of the 15th Line on the French side, and that's ended up shaking the 15th Line. Meanwhile, the 4th Battalion of the 66th Line has charged and pushed back the skirmish unit from the British brigade. Turn 7. Lenin has got his men forward now into the canal, and they're advancing in support of the British. The 2nd 15th line of the French have been pushed back by the end of turn 7 back towards the bridge, and the 1st 4th are now masters of Lawson's Mound, alongside them in support of the 1st 9th. Turn 8, Lenin's decides he'd rather stay in the canal, but nonetheless is there in support. And the skirmishers for Pringle have re-emerged, advanced again to harass and disorder the 4th 66th Line of the French. And then another battalion, the 6th 66th Line, has advanced to try and charge the supporting British battalion. So that was the end of the game. That was the end of turn 8. It was dark, and if we look at the victory conditions, the Allied requirement to advance to the banks of the Carrion without the division being broken. Well, they didn't get the division entirely broken. Barnes was broken, and the French were required to break both of the British brigades while remaining on the right bank of the Carrion. However, neither side actually achieved their victory conditions in full, so we can consider the game a draw, which as I mentioned right at the beginning of the video, in reality, Barnes got on a bit further than we saw in this game, and the French withdrew entirely across the Carrion. And finally, I just want to finish with some closer up shots of my troops. The battalions are all fairly small. I use a 33:1 figure scale to represent these historical refights, and so this is the 1st Battalion of the 4th Foot, and this is the 1st Asturias in the British supplied uniforms for the Spanish, and this is the 1st 9th Foot with General Pringle behind them. This is Robert Lawson's very experienced artillery brigade, including no doubt Thomas Rollins, who has the record for the largest number of clasps on his General Service Medal from the Royal Artillery. And here's the photograph I showed earlier on, this time of the first 15th line, which is using, in black powder terms, light infantry mixed to represent the fact that on the day the whole regiment was deployed into skirmish order. This photograph shows the 2nd Battalion of the 15th line in column, and you can see quite clearly here I've chosen to give some of these battalions the new 1812 fanions, which are a different colour for each battalion. There's some debate as to whether these were actually ever seen in Spain, but I think there's some strong evidence, not least from the Battle of Salamanca, that they were in Spain, and so I've used them for my recreations. And finally, the French cavalry. They didn't do a lot in this scenario, but they were decisive earlier in the day. There are 4 squadrons of chasseurs à cheval, and on the left looking at them is the 3rd Hussars. Well, that's the end of this video. As I say, it's all based on the research I did for this book, Wellington at Bay, which will be published later in this year by Carrion.co.uk. It was to be published at Salute, but obviously COVID-19 put pay to that, and so I'm at the moment waiting to get the chance to get it out there in print to everybody. Hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll be doing others based on the other scenarios that I talk about in Wellington at Bay. Thanks very much for listening and watching. Goodbye.